Did Judas Iscariot even exist? You know, the disciple who betrayed Jesus? When you go to the Apostle Paul, people like Dr. Ehrman have pointed out, this might have just been God who handed Jesus over, not Judas necessarily. But what about the Judas of the Gospels? Today, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald takes a deep dive with us, and he explains his perspective on what he thinks about the historical or non-historical Judas Iscariot. Dr. MacDonald, many people who are studying the Bible read about this guy who betrayed Jesus named Judas Iscariot. He is entered by Satan. He betrays a close friend, and he's one of the closest disciples, according to the Gospels, in the inner 12. And he betrays. And you are saying, I don't think he existed. Now, that's some shocking statements to make for some. I want to see the evidence, and I think it's important that we consider what you're saying today.
Thank you, Derek. This is one of the real treats to me of my research, to be able to trace the history of this villain in the gospel narratives and outside of the gospel narratives. It really is fun for me. But I need to start with the Q document. And I know a lot of people do not trust the Q document. And I would say then in that case, talk about the common traditions that are known by Matthew and Luke. So just think of it that way. In the Q document, we seem to have a list of the 12 disciples, none of whom plays a role in the narrative, but they have names. And as far as we know, the original list of the disciples included someone who is called Judas, the son of Jacob, or James, but because it appears in the list in Luke just before another Judas. This is Judas Iscariot. And that already appears in the Gospel of Mark, who's apparently changed Judas, the son of Jacob, to Judas Iscariot. But what does Iscariot mean? Nobody has ever been called before or after Judas been called an Iscariot. And there is no town that is going to qualify, like from Iscariot. It's a word that is a compound of the Greek preposition is, into, and kyrios, which means a village. So why would you say Judas into the city? It's because Melanthius, the villain in the Odyssey, is first appears in the Odyssey, and then again later, as driving goats into the city so that the suitors, Odysseus's enemies, can have their perpetual feasts. So Judas is into the city the way Melanthius is going into the city. Now you'd say, oh, MacDonald, that's a stretch. And I would say, yes, it's a stretch. I agree with you, but not in what follows. Because like Melanthius, the slave, who then sides with the suitors against his master, he arms them and helps fight against Odysseus and Telemachus. And in the end is when the suitors are dead, Odysseus has a special treatment for Melanthius, namely, he cuts off his ears, his nose, and his limbs, and gives the body to dogs to eat. So he is the one who gets punished most for being a turncoat. And of course, Judas is the one who betrays his master, becomes basically a slave of the chief priest because he's going to do the dirty work. The arrest of Jesus is not made by anybody else but Judas Iscariot coming with an armed group to oppose Jesus. And he's the one who has his ears cut off at the scene. He's the slave of the high priest, and he has his ears cut off, just as Melanthius had his ears and nose and limbs cut off.
Hold on, real quick. This is interesting. I've seen the scene in like the Passion of the Christ, right? And on the movie, it's a Roman soldier who gets his ear cut off. But you're saying that Judas got his ear cut off in the scene in the garden?
Well, it's obviously not a Roman soldier because it's a slave of the chief priest. And of course, Melanthius is a slave, and he's become the slave of the suitors, that is, of the enemy of Odysseus. So I'm pretty sure that the author is expecting one to see that Judas is the turncoat, now the slave, not of Jesus, the disciples, but of the chief priest. And then so he also has dismemberment. So that's the end of the story of Judas in the Gospel of Mark. But Matthew has a different story to tell. Now, in the Q document, or if you want the double tradition, the 12 are always treated positively. They are the ones that are going to take up their own crosses. They're the ones who are given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God. They're the ones who can endure with Jesus the hardships. And because of that, in the hereafter, in Jesus' kingdom, they will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So the author assumes that at his time, the disciples, or the 12, and they're called the 12, are noble and faithful and suffer with Jesus and will be rewarded with thrones. Mark hates that about the Q document or the tradition. Judas, one of the 12, is responsible for Jesus' death. Peter, a leader of the 12, betrays Jesus 3 times and is never restored to credibility in the Gospel of Mark. Jacob and James and John ask for thrones, which is similar to what you find in the Q document. You know, can we sit at your right and left hand, maybe with the other disciples? And Jesus says, nope, that is not mine to decide. That's for martyrs. If you want to be martyrs with me, that's okay. But of course, they flee at Jesus' arrest and never see the risen Jesus in Mark. Very radical move. Now, Matthew has a problem. On the one hand, he's redacting Mark, and so he also has a Judas who's a jerk, who's the traitor. But he's also redacting the Q document, and he includes the promise of thrones. So we're going to be reading from page 283. From the logo of Jesus, or the Q document, Matthew inherited the following. Quote, go ahead, When the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you too will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So now you have a promise to the 12. They're going to sit on thrones. But he also wants to redact Mark. And in Mark, you have Judas, who is hardly worthy of a throne. So how are you going to make him worthy of a throne? So we continue. From Mark, he inherited the Iscariot's betrayal. He thus also inherited a problem: how to make disgusting Judas worthy of a throne. Luke's solution comes at the beginning of Acts, where God slays Judas. Lottery selects Matthias to replace him. So that's the 12. Matthew's solution, written earlier, however, had been to make the scoundrel so contrite that he killed himself and thus shifted the blame to blame his betrayal to the Jewish authorities. His suicide sufficed to secure a seat in the coming kingdom. So go ahead and read.
Matthew 27, 3-10. Then, when Judas, the one who delivered him up, saw that Jesus had been condemned, he changed his mind, returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and elders, saying, I have sinned by delivering up innocent blood. But they said, what do we care? You see it, you see to it. And he threw the money into the sanctuary, left, went off, and hanged himself. But the chief priests took the money and said, it is not permitted to put these coins into the sacred treasury, since they are blood money. And after deliberating, they used some of the money to buy the potter's field for the burial of foreigners. Thus that field is called a plot of blood to this very day. Then what was said by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the purchase price set by some of the people of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord had commanded me.
So this is Matthew's solution to the problem he had. On the one hand, there's going to be that the 12 are going to sit on thrones. In Mark, one of the disciples is certainly not worthy of sitting on a throne and to have been faithful to Jesus. So by having this suicide of Judas, the author is trying to make him so remorseful that he can be reinstalled among the 12 and have a throne after all. So that's the Matthean story. But it was not good enough for Papias or Luke, as we're now going to see. Papias' informants. Papias was the bishop of Hierapolis in middle of Asia Minor, Western Asia Minor. And he wrote a book called Expositions of Logia about the Lord. And he has his own understanding of the death of Judas, which he gets from informants. And one can speculate on who those informants might be, but it's clear that he knows the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, he knows the Gospel of Matthew in 2 Greek versions, one of which probably was Q. But he likes Matthew generally, but he doesn't like Matthew's solution to this problem. That is, Judas got off way too easy. Papias' informants objected to Matthew's exculpation of Judas and invented a rival explanation of his death. This is what one finds in Apollinaris of Laodicea, who quoted Papias as follows.
Judas conducted himself in this world as a paradigm of impiety. His flesh became so bloated that he was unable to pass through an opening large enough for a chariot easily to pass. Not even the massiveness of his head could get through. They say that his eyelids were so swollen that he was entirely unable to see the light, and even physicians with magnifying glasses could not see his eyes, so deeply they had sunk beyond sight. His penis appeared to be more repulsive and larger than any such disgraceful member, and bloody discharge and maggots poured from all over his body, which caused injury whenever he attended to his bodily needs. They say that after many tortures and punishments, he died in his own plot, which became deserted and uninhabited even to this day due to its stench. Still today, no one can pass by that place without pinching his nostrils. Such was the efflux that seeped from his flesh to the ground.
Derek, how radically different is that from what we find in Matthew? And I'm so glad you read it, because I didn't want to read that disgusting passage, and you did it so well. Now, Apollinaris' introduction to this excerpt from the exposition explicitly links Matthew's account to those in Papias and Acts. In Acts 1 reads, Judas did not die by, no, this is Apollinaris. Judas did not die by hanging, but survived for a while because he was taken down before he choked. And the Acts of the Apostles makes this clear. Falling face down, he burst in the middle and all his guts poured out. In Two Shipwreck Gospels, I made the case for the following chain of literary dependence. Matthew has Judas commit suicide. Papias has God striking him down after he survived the choking, and Acts agrees with Papias and not with Matthew, even though it shares some materials along with Matthew. So the chart at the bottom of the page is very complex, and I don't think we need to read it, Derek. I think we can talk about it. We have the information in front of us. But here is an example of Luke agreeing with a non-canonical book in its interpretation of the death of Judas, as opposed to a canonical book. He likes Papias's version better than he likes the Matthean version. And Matthew is trying to make nice between the logoi of Jesus, or Q, and Mark, to make them harmonize in some way. So this is a beautiful example, I think, of Matthew's mimetic hybridity. He's got Q, he's got Mark, he's trying to put them together. They don't match. In fact, Mark is arguing against the Q document, that everybody's going to be nice and sit on a throne. It's only for the martyrs, because Mark's writing after the Jewish war. So this is a misunderstood history of tradition. So people have seen for centuries the similarities between the Acts account and Papias, but it's usually attributed to a common tradition. And I'm suggesting, it's literary imitation. Luke is agreeing with Papias. Matthew's version is too easy on Judas. Now, the reason that becomes important is, for me and in my hypothesis, is if Luke knows Papias, he also has to know about Matthew. And so this is against the two-document hypothesis that requires Luke's independence of Matthew. Of course Luke knows Matthew. But Luke also knows the Iliad. And when he talks about the lottery that chose Matthias to replace Judas, it comes right out of Iliad 7, a lottery to decide which of the Achaeans is going to try to go man-to-man with Hector. And that's elsewhere in the synopsis. But I'll guarantee you will not find, except in my books elsewhere and here, this way of understanding the tradition of the death of Judas, which I find to be so brilliant, not from me, but what Luke is doing in the Acts of the Apostles and what Papias is struggling to do. It really is a marvelous achievement, but it doesn't work, fundamentalist, for you, because you're reading these things as though they happened, and Judas, in fact, killed himself and so on. No, this is PR control. Matthew is trying to control the tradition so that you can still have the promise of thrones to the 12.
Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. We have obviously elaborated, exaggerated, if you will, stories about Judas. One, he betrays and is known as a betrayer to the end in Mark. There is no promise to thrones. In fact, Mark lacks a lot of Jewish or Israel ideas that you find in Matthew, from I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, or this is to fulfill, all of these fulfillment stuff. There's a fulfillment narration in Matthew that you don't find in Mark. And this is something that when I interviewed Bart Ehrman one time, I brought up this passage that we talked about, the judgment of the 12 tribes of Israel. And this was his response, right? Now, mind you, this is going to show you he's not seen the Greek. And so this is going to be an evident thing. And he goes, well, this is an embarrassment that Matthew would say, Jesus would say, you 12 will be ruling on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And he goes, Jesus didn't know that Judas would betray him. So this is a blunder that Jesus wouldn't have known. And therefore, he thinks this is a kernel back to a historical Jesus. in his mind, because he's like, well, it's evident if he really did know, right? This is a kind of mistake on the author's part in a way of like leaving it in there, that he thinks Judas is also going to have a throne. And so it works even in your position, because you're saying in Matthew, he redeems himself by committing suicide and going out of his way to go, no, I changed my heart and my mind, and Matthew's content with that. Mark doesn't even care. The guy can go out with a bang as an enemy. Luke comes in and, dude, he killed the Lord, okay? Like, you can't just go, oh, I'm sorry, and then get away with that. This is not okay with us.
Papias too.
And Papias. So they go so far. So I'm going to throw one idea too. I'm just throwing a bunch of spaghetti, and then I want to have this dialogue and give you wherever you want to go. I've even heard people try to say that the author is aware of Julius Caesar being betrayed by his inner circle, Brutus, which sounds in some way off the tongue, Brutus, Judas, that there might be something here. However, I've thought in a Hebrew mimesis, you have Joseph. His brother, the brother that didn't want to kill him, but did want to sell him, was Judah. And so here you have Judah selling, or saying, let's sell him instead of kill him. So he sells him. And in that context, I think it's 20 shekels, not 30. I could be wrong, but I think it's 20. Anyway, I saw this overlap and I went, what the heck? This is kind of weird. I also see some of the passion narrative in a weird way with what's going on in Joseph's story. He's in prison. He's in kind of a dungeon. And he tells two people of their dreams. One is a wine bearer. One is the baker, bread. And literally the loaves of bread are on his head in the dream. The other one is about the wine. The bread dies. He's going to die in 3 days. The wine bearer is going to be ascended on and be actually helping Pharaoh again. And as he's leaving the dungeon, he says, hey, don't forget about me. Do this in remembrance of me, Jesus says. So I always thought, whoa, something may be going on there. So anyway, there's a lot going on. These authors are skillful, and it's very complex to try and wrap my head around. But did Judas really exist? I mean, like, what the heck?
As far as I know, from my reconstruction of Q and other reconstructions of Q, no, he didn't exist. They did not know about one of the 12 as a betrayer. Now, I think the author of the Gospel of Mark may have read 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians, you have, with the words of institution in the Pauline version, the night that he was betrayed or handed over. Now, we don't know who was at the meal in the Pauline tradition. We don't know who the betrayer was. And by the way, it says on the night that he was betrayed. So the Markan version of Jesus's Last Supper takes place at night. It's at a meal. Those who are at the meal are the 12. And it's Judas who's the betrayer, and it's the same word that is used in Mark as it is in Paul. So that I think it's not implausible that Mark saw the 1 Corinthians 11 version or knew of that version of the Last Supper, and then wanted to give a name to the betrayer. Now, this business about Joseph and the Joseph cycle and so on, I want to respond to very briefly. I'm a big believer in eclectic mimesis. That is, that authors are taught in schools how to imitate more than one document at a time. And we certainly know that Mark has one foot in Judaism and another in the Hellenistic world. So that the fact that your suggestion is not on the surface implausible. The other thing to say is the name Judah is where we get the name also Judea and Jew. And by focusing on Judas, we may have an allusion to the betrayal, to a slur on Jews. I'm not sure about that, but it could be simply an accident. But there may be multiple solutions to it. But I do find that this history of intersynoptic disagreement should call attention to itself, so that those who wish to, as you put it, harmonize or homogenize these stories, are really fooling themselves, and they're not enjoying the diversity of early Christian speculation.
Last comment. You brought up 1 Corinthians 11. I've always enjoyed going here and finding what is going on in Paul. I hear from scholars, this could be easily understood as on the night he was handed over.
That's right.
And doesn't necessarily mean that there's a betrayal.
Absolutely.
And that a lot of them interpret this passage to mean God handed him over.
Yes.
So it's not a person or something like that. It could be understood. You could mistake it and say it's a person. So then it makes you wonder, is Mark taking Paul, sees this, creatively checks out the Iliad, the Odyssey, and says, hold up, someone betrayed Odysseus, and we know that he was betrayed, or at least Jesus gets handed over, and finds a creative way of creating that narrative.
I think that's what happened, and that's what I say in this book. Yep, I think that's what happened. And it was astonishing what I saw. Jesus sails the sea with a crew, that is his disciples, that are not nearly as noble as he is, like Odysseus. Like Odysseus, Jesus keeps his identity a secret so his enemies can't kill him. The Jewish authorities play the role of Penelope's suitors. They love the best seats in synagogues, and they're willing to kill in order to win the inheritance. Judas plays the role of Melanthius, Jesus' turncoat slave. Jesus has his feet anointed by a woman, like Odysseus having his feet anointed by his nurse Eurycleia, and she recognizes him from his scar. And the name Eurycleia means renowned far and wide. And it's said of this woman who anoints Jesus that wherever the gospel is proclaimed, it'll be in her memory. So these parallels were so striking that I dared not give a new lecture on it because it hadn't been digested. And so I spent another summer working through the Gospel of Mark, creating criteria that where I might be able to make a claim that there's a literary connection. And at point after point after point, it became clear that Mark was imitating not just the Odyssey, but also the Iliad and also some tragedian plays. And I translated Homer and Euripides and Plato for myself in order to compare the Greek of the Gospel of Mark with the Greek of these stories. And it was unbelievable what I was finding. I also turned to a study of Greek rhetoric and understood better how literary imitation or mimesis worked. And it was that people were taught how to write by imitating recognized models and to compare heroes in an activity called syncresis. Syncresis is simply a comparison to show that one character is similar but better than another. And of course, that's what's going on in Mark. Jesus is like Odysseus, but he's better than Odysseus. He's like Hector in his death, but he comes back to life. So that's a syncresis, and it goes on and on.